This is True Crime Arizona, Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hello, everyone. This is Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions, a True Crime Arizona podcast. I'm Morgan Lowe, and with me is investigative reporter Amy Cutler. And we have a couple of important updates on the Lori Vallow case. Amy, you've been following the court proceedings. Lori was in court. Chad appeared via Zoom from jail. So what was the main topic of this hearing?
Well, really the focus in this Idaho courthouse was, and the reason for the hearing was DNA. Specifically, the prosecution had run a DNA analysis of some hair that was found at the crime scene where they found Tylee and JJ's body. We don't know who that DNA belongs to, but prosecutors have just turned over that DNA to the defense teams. Now, the concern here is that Chad's defense team says they need more time to examine the DNA results, so they wanted to push back the trial, which was supposed to start in April, just 5 weeks from now. Now, Lori doesn't want to push back the trial. She has not signed away the right to a speedy trial, and so her attorney actually expressed some reservations about this. But right now, her trial is supposed to start April 3rd.
Whoa. So we've got a lot to unwrap here. Wow. Okay. So let's start with this DNA. I remember that when they found Tylee and JJ's bodies in Chad's backyard, there was some samples. I think there were hair samples on a couple of different spots. One of them was on the tape that was used to bind JJ. And they found some hair on that. So the prosecutors had said, we want to test this DNA because they really don't have any, other than the fact that that the bodies were in Chad's backyard. They don't have any links to Chad and Lori, direct, evidentiary links. So if that was hair that belonged to one of them, that would be really important. If you recall, they were led to the backyard there because they tracked Lori's brother, Alex Cox, via his cell phone to those spots in the backyard. So they had evidence through electronic means that Alex had been back there, and they found the bodies there. So they have evidence that lead to Alex as potentially being the killer, but nothing really directly for Chad and Lori. So that is really significant. Now, we don't know the results of that DNA at this point, but prosecutors had apparently had it tested, and then they have an obligation to turn those test results over to the defense. And then what Chad's lawyers were arguing was that, look, you can't just give us this a month before trial. We now need to digest this. They need to see if the DNA matches their client. They need to challenge it and get experts and that kind of thing. So that's sort of the reasoning for challenging it. And I guess that sets up why this DNA could be that important. So what did the judge decide on this?
Well, the judge basically said that the prosecution had turned over this evidence pretty late in the game, and so he understood where Chad's attorney was coming from. Chad has signed away his right to a speedy trial, so the trial could be pushed back for his side of things. Important to note, Chad's attorney had requested that the case be severed in the past. The judge had been reluctant to do that, but now, in fact, he has ruled that this case should be severed, and it's basically comes down to the fact that Lori doesn't want to wait. She doesn't want the case to be pushed back. She wants things to move forward.
Yeah, prosecutors didn't mind if the case was severed in the past. And Chad's lawyers and Chad and Lori's lawyers had been reluctant in the past to say let's sever the case, and then Chad's lawyers changed their tune. So this is interesting because there is some thought that having them on trial together lessens the idea that one of them might turn on the other one if they're standing together. So you could see why a defense attorney would want them to be together in trial. On the other hand, it makes you kind of wonder if there's another motive for Chad's lawyers wanting the trial to be wanting them to be separated and severed and not tried together. It is interesting that Lori's attorneys said, this is not our advice. They want time to digest this DNA. But Lori, who is the defendant, has the ultimate say-so. You're the client. You can decide. And she's saying, let's go forward. We don't know if it's actually going to start. I think it's safe. It's important to understand that it's really the defense. It's the defendant's call on whether to waive a speedy trial. We've all heard if you're charged with a crime in the United States, you have a right to a speedy trial. It shouldn't drag on for years. But if the defendant waives that right, then sometimes their team can investigate leads and try to find something that might bring up some, reasonable questions about whether the defendant did it. So it's oftentimes in the defense's, in their favor to waive the right to a speedy trial. So here you've got Chad saying, we waive the right, we want to delay, we want to look at this. And Lori's saying, no, we want to go right to trial. What do you make of that?
I know it's kind of hard to with reason to think that Lori feels that they have a really strong case, and I think that she feels like she wants to move forward as quickly as possible. She feels like these the charges are not right, and it's interesting to note, too, her attorney had actually asked the case to be dismissed based off of the fact that this has not been a speedy trial. And the judge weighed that and then pointed out the fact that there's been 2 mental competency issues and pauses in the case. And so, and it is a death penalty case, so it's going to take some time as well. Mm-hmm. So it's there's a lot of factors in this, and it was interesting in court. The judge acknowledged that the prosecution turned over this DNA evidence pretty late in the game.
Mm-hmm. So you understand why, as you said, the judge would say, "Okay, I'm going to grant severing this case." One thing that is interesting here, and may make the fact that Lori wants to proceed make a little more sense, because you reported last month in one of the court hearings that Lori's attorneys have sort of showed their hand a little bit in how they're going to pursue their defense. They say she has an alibi. They say that she was with her friends the night, I believe, that JJ disappeared, and they say that she was in Hawaii when Chad's then wife, Tammy, died. So they've sort of said, look, we're going to proceed with this defense, and it'll be interesting to see those arguments. Now, that doesn't necessarily clear her, because if the prosecutors paint this description of her being part of the conspiracy to commit murder, and so she's just an element, like a spoke in the wheel, she may not have had to have been there. But the fact that they have disclosed that she had an alibi shows they're going to proceed down that path, and maybe she thinks that is the best path to take. Her lawyers didn't think so. They still wanted more time to gather evidence and to look at this DNA. So what did the judge say about the exact timing of when these trials could take place? Was there a specific date given today, or given when the court hearing happened? By the time you hear this podcast, it will have been at least the week before.
Yes. So Lori's trial is now set to start April 3rd. They are pushing forward. The start of his trial has now been pushed back at least till the end of the year. We don't have a specific date yet, but the judge had said at least till the end of the year. So his attorneys will have several more months to look at this evidence, have it tested, gather their experts. It's going to be months down the line, and then they're saying each of their trials will last at least 10 weeks.
Yeah. Wow. So, I'm thinking, what takes so long? Why do they need 6 months? Why do they need another year? And from covering other cases and seeing this before, the types of things they're likely to do is one, see if this DNA could match other people. Two, they're going to attack the methods for choosing the DNA or for examining the DNA. And again, we don't know what that DNA evidence is. We don't know if it's Chad's DNA or Alex's DNA or somebody else's DNA. The prosecutors may have found, a hair there that belongs to somebody that they don't even know. And so that's an opportunity for the defense to say, look, the one piece of physical evidence that was at the scene is the DNA to somebody who we have no idea who it is. So it really is an important piece of the puzzle there. And that's why it could take a long time for the defense team to look at this and decide what they're going to do with this. Is this DNA going to be a critical piece of the prosecution's case because it links one of them? Or is it going to be a critical piece of the defense case because it introduces somebody else, some other person into this equation? We don't know. That information has not been disclosed. It could get disclosed before a trial, but most likely it will get disclosed at trial. But that would be Chad's. Now we're talking about Lori's trial starting in the beginning of April. And at this point, we don't even have cameras allowed in the courtroom. If you remember, it was within the last year, the judge had ruled on, I believe it was a defense motion, to keep cameras out of the courtroom. And the judge had said, there's no evidence that the cameras have caused any problems yet, but we are going to keep them out of the courtroom because the defense brought up some issues about potentially seeing Chad or Lori talking to their attorneys. And so the judge said no cameras in the courtroom at this point. What is happening on that front right now, Amy?
Well, we know that East Idaho News has requested that the judge reconsider that. They want cameras in the court for the trial. And it'll be interesting to see how the judge rules on that.
Yeah, so they said, we understand that pretrial proceedings have an important role in this, and we're not asking for cameras in the courtroom during the pretrial proceedings. But in the East Idaho newsletter was interesting. They said that family members of the victims have had a hard time finding out exactly what has been happening in this, and they are going to want to watch the proceedings. And so opening the proceedings to cameras in the courtroom, they're arguing, is an easy and fair way to do that. So it's interesting with the media at this point saying we've heard from victims' family members and not just making the argument that the media and the public should be allowed in an open courtroom. Idaho has its own specific laws, but there are general laws and rules that govern whether cameras or media or the public are allowed in the courtroom. And, is sort of the rule of thumb, the sort of simple way to say it is that the judge has to identify that there by sort of clear and convincing evidence that opening this proceeding to the media will affect the defendant's right to a fair trial. And that the only way to ensure the fair trial is to close the courtroom or to eliminate the media access to it. But there's a caveat there. And it's from something called the press enterprise test that sort of governs media and public access to the courtroom. And that caveat is that any closure needs to be narrowly tailored to eliminate the threat to a fair trial while protecting the greatest public access to the proceeding. So that's the part where it's not just the judge says the media are allowed in there or they're not, or the cameras are allowed in there or they're not. We are covering the Zombie Hunter trial. It's another podcast, True Crime Arizona, the Zombie Hunter. We've got all the highlights on that podcast. But in that case, the defense and the prosecution had moved to close the courtroom to cameras. And we argued as the media that they haven't shown that there's going to be this overarching sort of danger to the defendant's right to a fair trial. So the judge took everything and basically said, well, there are going to be some witnesses that the cameras can't shoot, but overall the cameras are allowed in the courtroom. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the TV networks, because the Vallow case is high profile. It's why we're talking about it. It is why people are listening to it. It affects our community here in Arizona because Tylee and JJ and Lori lived here. Lori's ex-husband, Charles, who police and prosecutors say was murdered here, was here. So this has an importance to our audience. I wouldn't be surprised if the TV news networks go in and make an argument, like a formal argument in front of the judge, that there are steps the judge can take to limit the detrimental effects of cameras in the courtroom, but not just cut off complete, camera coverage of it. But the clock is ticking. If this trial is supposed to start in April and we still don't know definitively that we're going to have cameras in the courtroom, there's a lot of arguments to be made between now and April. So, and hopefully we will be there to cover that trial, at least parts of it. But Amy, anything else stand out for you? You've really covered this case for the last couple of months. I've been watching from the sidelines, working on the Zombie Hunter. But what else to you stands out to you from the last couple of months leading up to the trial?
It was interesting talking to a reporter that was in the courtroom yesterday. They had mentioned that Lori's demeanor was just a little bit different. She just came into court kind of really confident, which might go to, she was quiet, but they said confident, which is kind of interesting. She must feel pretty comfortable with the case. She feels, she is in the right here. It'll be interesting to see what happens with cameras in the court and also what arguments her attorneys make. Another interesting kind of side note was, the mental competency part of things, because the prosecution has been kind of watching that to see, they don't want the defense kind of mentioning that. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out at trial as well.
Anytime I cover a trial, I always spend a lot of time watching the defendant, like that just little tidbit that you added about how the reporter viewed Lori Vallow's demeanor, because the demeanors change, and we're not in the business of reading minds, but we can read body language, just like anybody else can. And there are things in body language that can tell you about people, and especially, I think, in trial. So that is all for now. But we are going to be back with another update and more updates, and probably more of them closer together as we get closer to a potential Lori Vallow trial. So for now, I'm Morgan Lowe.
I'm Amy Cutler.
And we will talk to you next time.
This is True Crime Arizona, Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.